What's up everybody, my name is Bobby and today I'm going to be giving you guys 10 things that I wish I knew before I went and purchased the iPhone 14 Pro Max. So I've been using the phone now for probably 5 days and I've noticed a couple of little quirks that I figured I would share with you guys. Hopefully you find the information useful. Other than that though, make sure you stay tuned and let's just jump right into it. Now before I dive into the list, I should note that I don't really believe that any of these particular things that I'm about to mention are deal breakers per se, but they're just little quirks that I noticed and something that I think is worth at least being aware of. Many of them potentially will be fixed with software updates, and even though I haven't published my review of the phone yet, I do genuinely really love it and I do think it is a big improvement. But there are a couple of little things that I think do need to be addressed and I figured I would share that here with you. Number one, now for those of you who have used an iPhone in the past, you're probably familiar with when you're scrolling down any sort of page, whether it's your photo library, whether it's a web page or just something where you have to scroll down, you're usually able to just tap right on the top of the phone near where the original notch was and now where the dynamic island is, and once you do so it'll shoot you back up to the very top of the page, and it's a really convenient way if you've been scrolling for a while to just get back to the top instead of having to swipe a million times to get yourself back to that starting point. Now because of the way that the dynamic island is, you actually have to tap above where the dynamic island is in order to do that same mechanic, whereas before it was like right below where the notch is. I kept trying to do it right below the dynamic island and that obviously didn't work, so it's just something that I thought I would share with you guys. I don't know if I've seen anyone mention that. Maybe that'll be fixed in a software update, but it's just something to be aware of. Number two has to do with traditional wireless chargers. So, the last couple of years have been steering everyone towards MagSafe chargers, which are great, but I had a bunch of wireless chargers that I owned before MagSafe was a thing, like this one from Nomad here, which I really like because it has the nice little leather pad and it looks really clean. But one thing I did notice is that because of how massive the camera bump is on the 14 Pro Max, it actually sits up at an angle almost when you lay it flat on a traditional wireless charger. And I noticed that it was kind of finicky almost to get it to charge sometimes. It would charge, but I did notice that it was like, it almost seemed like you were charging it from a distance wirelessly as opposed to just sitting right on the device. Maybe that was just my own personal use case, but I figured I would mention it. They definitely are steering us towards MagSafe, which I think is better in my opinion, but if you do own a lot of wireless chargers, maybe something like a big bulky case might not be conducive to getting it to lay flat enough to where it could wirelessly charge. I've been using Apple's leather cases and I did notice that the way the camera bump is, it sits up almost like at an angle. It's pretty wild how big that bump is now. Number three, we're going to talk about the dynamic island itself. So this is probably one of the hottest UI interface features that Apple has added in a long time and is honestly my favorite part of the new phone, which is kind of ridiculous. Nobody really saw that coming, how awesome it was going to be, but it seems pretty unanimous that people really love that particular feature, and I can confirm it is quite amazing. The only gripe I have with it is how little of things actually use it. So a lot of Apple's core applications will utilize it at this point. So things like music, things like navigation, things like, connecting AirPods, you see notifications or switching on and off, the silent mode, or using Face ID. A lot of things built into the system that you use on a regular basis will utilize the dynamic island. But I've noticed, at least at the time of filming this, pretty much none of the third-party applications use it unless it's like a music app that already is using the same API or whatever it is that lets it, be thrown up to the top and sit within the dynamic island when you're not having the actual window open. I really do hope more third-party applications, find creative ways to utilize it because I think it is super useful and a really neat feature, but it feels early days at the moment. It's like any new feature that requires all app makers to update their app to take advantage of it. That's kind of where we're at with this. So I wouldn't expect it to be utilized in every aspect of your daily, usage flow on the phone. Something to be aware of. I think it will come to all the major applications at some point, but at least at this point, it's pretty much just Apple's core applications. Up next, we're going to talk a little bit about the always on display. So one thing that I noticed is the always on display is great. I'm still getting used to it, to be honest. It is a little weird always seeing your phone on whenever it's sitting on a surface. But one thing that it dawned on me is that because that display is always on, it's on when it's in your pockets. At least that's my understanding. I don't have any way to actually check in my pockets, but my understanding is it is on when it's in your pocket. And I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know if it's gonna the heat from, my leg is gonna think it's like a touch or something. I don't know. But the weirdness that made me notice this is when I did pull it out of my pocket, you would see your wallpaper, and my brain, at least at this point, since I'm not 100% used to it yet, my brain would think, oh, okay, my phone's on, and I would tap one of the notifications, but that tap would only activate the always on display to being the fully lit, fully interactive version of your lock screen. And so I would have tapped the application, nothing happens, and it lights up. I'm like, oh yeah, I have to tap it again. And then you have to tap it again. It literally takes 1 second, but it is a weird little thing that your brain is trying to calculate while you're doing it. I think that will just come with time. Or maybe they release some sort of software update where it can recognize when it's in a pocket or where it can recognize when it's face down. Something like this that can also potentially save battery life and just trigger the always on display when it's uncovered in some way. I think that would be a great solution because it also does affect battery life, which we will talk about battery life in one of these future things I wish I knew. But at least from a putting it in my pocket perspective, I wish there was some sort of way for that to be noticed. But as of right now, I believe it is still on in the pocket. And that is kind of a weird UI thing when you first pull it out and you have to basically double tap it to get it, woken up essentially. Up next, we're going to talk about the battery life of the phone. So Apple has added a couple of new things to the phone that are, from a software perspective and a hardware perspective that definitely put a little bit more strain on it. And to my knowledge, I don't believe they increased the battery capacity or anything like that. So I have noticed that it does get taxed battery life wise pretty heavily. And the main things I think contributing to that are going to be the always on display, which we just spoke about, being that even though it is at an extremely low power mode, it does have an effect on battery life having that on. You can turn it off, but I like it on. It's one of the new features and reasons I bought the new phone, so I want it on. There's not a ton of new features, and that just happens to be one of the most noticeable ones, so I do want it on. And then the other thing that I recently learned does affect battery life as well is the turning on of the haptics for the keyboard when you're typing. Now, in my opinion, that's been one of the best updates to iOS 16 is the ability to, when you're typing, feel that little vibration or haptic feedback. Apple's haptic engine is phenomenal, and it does a really good job of making it feel like a tactile experience when you're typing with it. I didn't know that it affected battery life, until very recently, but that makes a lot of sense now. So those two particular things will affect battery life. I guess the haptic piece isn't exclusive to the iPhone 14, whereas the always on display is, but just be aware between those two things you do get an effect on battery life. And my experience has been my 14 Pro Max is performing similarly battery wise to my 13 Pro Max at the end of the year that I had it when I was running the beta, which is notorious for being not optimized for battery performance and really, sucking the juice out of your phone. So my phone was getting burned through pretty quickly when I was running iOS 16 beta on my 13 Pro Max after a year of use. But The 14 Pro Max I find performs pretty similar to that. I actually gave my fiance my 13 Pro Max, and she uses her phone probably about the same as me, which is too much. And randomly throughout the day, I'll ask her, I'd be like, hey, what's your battery percentage at right now? Just to see kind of where we both stacked up. It was pretty similar across the board every time I asked her. Now, that's obviously not like a scientific evaluation of that. That's really just kind of anecdotal, but it's something I figured I would mention. And maybe there's ways to optimize it that don't involve having to turn off two of my favorite new features. Who knows? I work from home, so I'm always near a charger anyway, so it doesn't make a huge difference to me because I'm always able to charge it. And I'm usually able to go a full day's worth of usage because that battery is pretty big at the end of the day. But it's really on the days where I'm doing things like this and filming a bunch, or if we're out and I'm taking a ton of pictures or videos, I do notice it does get drained quicker on those days and gets lower than I would prefer. So I usually end up charging it up on those days, but just figured I would mention. Now, another thing I wish I knew beforehand, well, I don't know if this is technically I wish I knew before I got my 14, because I actually did this before I got the 14 because I figured it might be helpful, but I wanted to share it with you guys if you're planning on picking up a iPhone 14. For those of you who don't know, the iPhone 14 in the US at least is eSIM only. So it does not have a SIM card tray anymore. If you are the kind of person like me who like to buy phones unlocked and take the SIM out of your old phone, put it in the new phone, you're not going to be able to do that the same way. So what I did beforehand on my 13 Pro Max is in the carrier settings of the phone, I converted my traditional SIM card to an eSIM card. And they make it very easy to do that. You literally just go to carrier settings and then carrier, and it should be one of the options like convert to an eSIM if you have an iPhone that supports eSIM. I don't know how far back that goes, but I know the 13s for sure had it. I'm guessing the 12s did. I don't know how much farther back than that though. I converted it to an eSIM beforehand, and then when I got my new phone and I was going through the setup, there was a new splash screen that I hadn't seen before, at least I didn't remember, that had to do with transferring the service from a nearby phone. And I was able to transfer the service from my eSIM on my 13 to the eSIM on my 14, and it was super smooth. I didn't have to call the carrier, I didn't have to log into my AT&T account, I didn't have to do anything. It just did it all within the phone. It was really, really smooth, way smoother than I was expecting. I thought it was going to be an absolute nightmare trying to get my stuff over just because of how many people were going to be doing it on launch day, but it was very easy. So I would recommend converting your phone SIM card to an eSIM before you do the transfer. I don't know what the experience is like without doing that ahead of time. I imagine it's pretty straightforward as well, but at least for me, I thought that that was the smoothest way to do it, and I figured I would mention it here. Up next, we're going to talk about the dynamic island again. One thing that I noticed is a lot of the third-party apps that I use are cut off in a weird way by the dynamic island, because while the dynamic island, God, it's so weird saying that, while the dynamic island takes up less space than the old notch did on the 13s, it's farther down the screen. And so all the apps are not accounting for that notch being farther down the screen. And I've noticed the text in the top part of the menu is cut off on a lot of things that it wasn't on the 13. So I think that's something that's just gonna change over time. I imagine they're gonna, I don't know how these things work, but I imagine there's a way to recognize what device it's using and kind of account for that when it comes to apps or web pages or things like that. Not positive, but I've seen them make changes to accommodate the notch in the past. I assume they'll do that again. So we'll see how that all shakes out. I imagine this won't be a problem farther down the road, but at least where we're at now, some of the apps do get cut off. Now, I should also note that none of these cutoffs were critical to a point where it made my experience bad, but it was just something I noticed. And I think, if you pick up a 14 Pro Max, it is something that you will notice. I didn't have any sort of information that was critical for me to see that it cut off, and most of the time it could be mitigated by just scrolling down a little bit. but it is something that is the case. I assume it'll change, but I just wanted to let y'all know. Next up, we're gonna talk about the camera. So one of the big things they announced when they announced the iPhone 14 Pro specifically was the brand new 48 megapixel camera. Now, this is the first jump in megapixels that we've had for an iPhone camera in a long time, and iPhones were able to take some unbelievably high quality photos with just a 12 megapixel sensor. So a lot of people were super excited about this 48 megapixel sensor. One thing to kind of note, the camera does not default to utilizing the full 48 megapixels when just right out the box. It won't do the full 48 megapixels. It won't take advantage of that. The only way to get a full 48 megapixel photo on your iPhone is to go into the camera settings and toggle on the ability to shoot raw photos. And so raw photos absorb a ton more information and data of whatever you're taking a picture of, which in turn is manipulatable in a photo editing application that gives you a ton more ability to actually, edit and manipulate different aspects of the lighting and texture and all that jazz. It just lets you manipulate it really deeply. Now, I've played around with this a lot. I'm by no means a professional photographer. I've got I do have a Sony mirrorless camera. I have dabbled around with Lightroom, and I'm trying to learn that kind of stuff, but I'm at such a, novice level of understanding of it. And so I shot a bunch of photos in RAW, which they do take up a ton more space. So they did make it, once you've turned on the ability to shoot in RAW, it adds a new toggle that you can turn off and on, which I thought was really convenient because if I'm remembering correctly, I think you used to only be able to turn it off and on by having to go back through the settings. So the settings toggle unlocks the in-camera toggle, which you can then turn off and on, which I did appreciate that because if there was, something I wanted that was a really, awesome landscape or something I wanted to take a really good picture of, it let me turn it on really quickly and use the full 48 megapixel sensor to go ahead and take that photo. Now, after I've taken a bunch of these photos, in the camera roll, it will do Apple's automatic enhancements, if you will. So it will enhance the photo in a certain way and make it look really good on your phone. Now, I'm not 100% positive if the version you're looking at on your phone is the 48 megapixel version, or maybe there's like two versions, or you only get all the data when you offload it to something like Lightroom. I'm not exactly sure, but what I did notice is the photos didn't look significantly better on the phone. So when I took a 48 megapixel photo on my phone, maybe it's placebo. There were certain times where I thought it did look better for sure, but not by a lot. And I feel like to most people who, don't care about this kind of stuff probably wouldn't notice the difference. Now, the next piece is when I offloaded those photos to Lightroom. And that was a really interesting experience because while I've dabbled with Lightroom, I kind of suck at it, to be honest. And I feel like most people who know how to use Lightroom, I've seen some photos edited in Lightroom with the 48 megapixel sensor, and they're unbelievable. It is so noticeable how much better the photos are. It's wild that that's a phone photo. It's absolutely insane. When I tried to do it, it definitely looked better. I think maybe that's just bias because I was, trying to justify it to myself. But I think it's one of those things where I guess this is playing more to the pro market because I feel like you need to know how to do things like edit raw photos well to even really take advantage of that new feature. It seems like such a niche market of people that know how to utilize that feature. Now, this is just strictly speaking from a photo perspective. I have noticed improvements video-wise that are pretty phenomenal due to the new sensor, but photo-wise, it's really interesting. I still don't know how I feel about it. I mean, I guess there's no harm in having a better camera. I never will say no to a better camera, but it is one of those weird things where you kind of have to know what you're doing to really get the full effect of it, which very few of us, I would imagine, do. Next up has to do with the SOS texting feature. So if you guys aren't aware, in the iPhone 14 lineup this year, Apple announced this new ability to be able to communicate with satellites if you are in an area that has no service and you need to get a message out. You are going to be able to, point your phone at a certain satellite and it'll connect to the satellite and be able to relay an emergency message through satellite as opposed to cell towers, and get you ideally the help that you need in those emergency situations. Now, when this feature first got announced, my impression, and I think some other people I saw online's impression, was that this will be available if you are in a area that doesn't have service and need to get a message out. My understanding was that that could be to anyone you needed to get a message out to, but we have since learned that it's only for emergency services. So if you need, any sort of medical help or emergency services in any way, that's when you'll be able to use this feature. This isn't to text your mom, hey, I'm coming down from a hike, I'll, should be back in an hour. It's not one of those things, which would have been nice. Maybe that'll be the case in the future. Just something that I think you guys should be aware of, because that would suck to buy if you're one of those people who wants to buy the phone specifically for that. That would suck to do that and then realize that you can't use it for just whatever you want. So just something to be aware of. Now, the last thing I want to share has to do with cases for the iPhone 14 Pro Max. This may be obvious, you may know this already, but it is something that I think some people would be curious about, so I figured I'd share it here. If you have an iPhone 13 Pro Max, your case will not fit on the iPhone 14 Pro Max, and that's because the camera is much bigger on the 14 Pro Max, bigger than the 13 Pro Max. So this camera cutout will not fit it, which is such a bummer because, I love seeing, especially like some of the leather cases from like Nomad or other brands. I really like seeing how they patina. This one right here is my English tan case from Nomad with Horween leather for my 13 Pro Max, and it was really starting to get good and was kind of crossing over this threshold to be able to, see the full thing patina, and I had, have to retire it now for the new cases, which is always kind of a bummer, but just something I thought you should be aware of. You will have to get a new case for your 14 Pro Max. That just about does it though. Thank you guys so much for watching. If there's anything you think I missed, I'm really curious, or if you've had a 14 Pro Max and you've noticed anything odd, leave a comment down in the description below. I know there's other glitches and things going on with the phone. I haven't experienced any of those. I really just tried to keep it to what my personal experience was. But yeah, there's definitely some quirks. Nothing's perfect when it first comes out, but my general opinion is that this is still an improvement for sure. Now, if you had last year's phone, is it enough of an improvement to make it worth spending another $1,000+? That's up to you. But this has been 10 things that I wish I knew before I bought the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Hopefully it's helpful. Stay tuned to the channel for all the iPhone 14 coverage, the Apple Watch Ultra coverage, which should be starting at the end of this week, along with the AirPods Pro 2 coverage, and lots of good stuff coming in the holiday season. So thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.